Well, we have a few empty places today as we have about 35 people who are in Ecuador as we speak. And that's left a few holes in other places as well. We have a blood drive going on today. It starts at 11:30 right out here in the parking lot to the south. And I want to share with you an email that I got this morning from the person who's in charge of this. Our summers are typically a critical time of the year as donations tend to decrease, though the need actually increases during this time. It's pretty neat to know that the blood collected during your blood drive will be on a hospital shelf within 72 hours, making a direct impact in the patients and their families. All donors will also get a brand new custom t-shirt. See there, you got to come get a t-shirt. That will be provided to all who roll up their sleeves to save lives. Plus, once again this year, all donors will receive a BOGO voucher to the Texas Rangers. So goal today we have is 25 units, and we're short of that right now with our sign-ups. But that 25 units can actually save 75 lives. So I want you to please consider, let's make the goal. Come on, help me out today. Some of you who have maybe thought about giving blood and haven't or whatever, please come out and do that this afternoon. We have a sign-up sheet. I don't know why they even have that. I think it's so they kind of have a vague idea of how many are going to give. But you can come back there without even signing up, okay? Please come do that. And if you're 17 or older, you can give, by the way. Malaya? I can't say that movies, I'm not much of a movie watcher, and so I can't say that movies have greatly influenced my life. There's been a few who momentarily I've sat there and maybe contemplated some things, but there's one movie that I will confess to you has really affected my life, and it's Frank Capra's old movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And I bet nearly everybody in here has seen that movie. But in this movie, George Bailey, who is played by Jimmy Stewart, struggles to believe that his hometown of Bedford Falls can actually fulfill him, can actually give him enough, provide him enough to fulfill him. Living in an old, drafty house with one woman in a little place with the same old job, just doing good things for neighbors. To him, it felt like life is mundane. He was restless. He wanted more out of life. And at one point, he says to his father, I couldn't face being cooped up for the rest of my life in a shabby little office. I want to do something big, something important. And there's two thoughts that George Bailey had that I think many of us have had at some time. And it goes something like this. One of them is, if I'm to be successful, if I'm to be important, then I must travel somewhere else other than where I currently live. And the second one is, once I get there, then I can be satisfied and happy and content and fulfilled. Now, if those two ideas were two balloons, Ecclesiastes pops both of them. And so we're in this study of Ecclesiastes. We kind of introduced the story the book last week. But I want to go back to verse 1, and I want to read the first 3 verses here. The words of the teacher, and this has been translated teacher or preacher, different things. I prefer the translation preacher. The words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? I want to key in on that word gain for just a moment. Because many of us, when we read this and we read the word gain, we're thinking of some kind of a material increase in our lives. But the preacher places this word gain within the context of a search for what is meaningful. And by doing so, he gives us a hint that he intends to broaden the definition of what it means to gain in this life. We humans are soul-starved people. And we're scavenging and we're searching for some kind of reason, for some kind of purpose, for some kind of point to it all. We want our lives to count. We want our lives to matter. But the preacher's going to painfully deconstruct all of our dreams and all of our expectations. And we don't want to believe what he says. We don't want to believe that this life is meaningless under the sun. And so he's going to spend the rest of this chapter proving his point. Now, how are we to understand what the preacher means when he repeatedly says, some of your translations say vanity of vanities, or everything is meaningless? Remember when he says everything, he's talking about this life under the sun, a horizontal perspective of life. I want us to think for just a moment about rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of speaking. It's the art of choosing right words to convey what you want to say. And so today we hear a number of people saying things like, there is no absolute truth. Do you realize when a person says there is no absolute truth, they are making an absolute claim? They're wanting us to believe that it is true that no truth exists. Well, the preacher's doing something similar when he says meaningless. Meaningless. When he opens this book by saying this, let's remember that what he is saying is actually full of meaning. But there's a difference between the way he says it and the way the skeptic says there is no truth. Because when he says meaningless, he knows that he's being contradicting. In fact, he's hoping that you and I, the listeners of this message, the readers of this message, will take seriously what he says and find meaning in it. He wants to point out that where we're often looking is vain and it's meaningless, so that we will discover what isn't vain and meaningless. So, verse 3, what do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? And then he gives his response in verse 4 when he says, generations come and generations go. Boy, this is exciting. This is encouraging stuff so far, isn't it? There's a purpose to his madness. The psalmist said in Psalm chapter 90, this psalm, by the way, is attributed to Moses, and he says in verse 10, our days may come to 70 years or 80 if your strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. We are born into this world and we live our lives and we die. But the earth just keeps on going. It's like when you're at the beach and you're walking on the sand and you leave footprints in the sand, and man, those footprints are there at least till high tide. And after that, it washes away any remembrance that you ever even passed that way. We're quickly forgotten. A few years ago at the Grammy Awards, Paul McCartney performed live. And social media exploded with young people asking the question, who is Paul McCartney? And he's not even dead yet. Now, I'm not being critical of young people because we all do this. If I was to mention Kanye West or Katy Perry or Big Sean, there's many of us my age or older who are going, who is that? When I was in high school, the oldie stations played songs from the 50s. Now, the oldie stations are playing songs from the 90s. And I couldn't name probably one of them for you. And so I got to thinking, sometimes I listen to K-Love, and K-Love pretty much plays songs from my time, songs from the 70s. And this was very sobering to me when I realized me listening to K-Love right now is the same as if when I was in high school I was listening to songs from the 20s. Man, this coming and going can rock our boat, can't it? And it mocks us how quickly we're forgotten. Joseph, you remember in the Old Testament, this man who God used to be second in command in Egypt, how quickly this man who saved Egypt was forgotten. Look at what it says in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came into power in Egypt. Wow, his legacy lived a long time, didn't it? And you've got Moses and Joshua, two of these great men who led Israel in very difficult times, and yet we get to the book of Judges and listen to what it says. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. They were forgotten. And so Ecclesiastes says in chapter 1 and verse 11, no one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. Then the preacher makes an observation from nature for emphasis. He says in the last part of verse 4, but the earth remains forever. We come and go. We live and we die, but the earth remains forever. Forever. And then he goes on to say this in verse 5. The sun rises, the sun sets, and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. Realize today we look at the same sun that Adam and Eve looked at. And there's this river that we all know about in Israel, the Jordan River. It's not that significant of a river, but I want you to think about that river that's been flowing all these years. And Abraham's been there, and Moses, and Joshua, and David, and Elisha, and John the Baptist, and Jesus. And they all came, and they saw it, and they experienced it, and they left. But that river keeps on flowing. Beverly and I have been there a couple of times and seen that river and left, and it keeps on flowing, and it's going to be flowing when we're gone. And other human beings are going to come, and they're going to take their turn, and they're going to also leave. And looking for gain in all of this, the preacher says, looking for gain in all of this is like trying to build a snowman in Decatur in July. And so he says in verse 8, all things are wearisome, more than one can say. In Texas, we would say, everything's bone tired, wearisome. The contemporary English version says, all of life is far more boring than words could ever say. Life never just resolves into peace and contentment. And we can never stop in our quest for happiness because we never come to a point where we totally grasp it. And so why bother? That's the preacher's question. Why bother? And he then moves from nature to human experiences, and he sees the same thing there too. Listen to what he says the last part of verse 8. The eye never has enough seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. Some people try to escape the monotony of life. They try to escape the futility of life by constantly keeping their senses filled. And so, we're now seeing a generation where they can't do anything without earbuds in their ears, or watching YouTube or Pandora or Netflix, or being totally absorbed in sports. We've got to have this constant activity filling our senses and filling our minds, but none of it ever satisfies, because there's always one more song to hear, always one more movie to watch, always one more game to play, and we are insatiable in our appetites. We're like a little child 2 days after Christmas who's already bored with what they got. And we'll never stop and admit with resignation, I just can't do it. We're like a hamster that's trapped in one of those exercise wheels, just keeps on going and keeps on going. It's been said that human beings are the only animal that speeds up when it's lost. And so when we realize that life is wearisome and without meaning, what do? Let's just speed up. Let's add another activity to our schedule. Let's just keep busy and keep busy. Busy, busy, busy. And so this under the sun culture in which we live has now convinced us that busyness is really a very good attribute to have. It's a status symbol. Whoever's the busiest, that's the person that our culture most admires. Where's it all taken us? And so the preacher says in verse 9, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, there's something new? It was here already long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. So, what do we gain? We do things over and over and over again with no real profit, no real progress, or as Pink Floyd put it years ago in a song, Dark Side of the Moon. So you run and you run to catch up with the sun, but it's sinking, racing around to come up behind you again. The sun is the same in a relative way, but you're older, shorter of breath, and one day closer to death. By the way, the preacher in these verses is not saying that there's no new inventions, there's no new discoveries. That's not what he means when he says there's nothing new under the sun. Rather, the context of this chapter is the meaninglessness of our pursuits, the meaninglessness of the lack of any gain under the sun. Think about it. The invention of computers, the space stations, all of these great inventions that we have enjoyed over the last 100, 200 years, it hasn't cut into the poverty rate. It hasn't cut into war. It hasn't cut into crime. Medical advances are helping our bodies to heal and do better than used to, but what have they really done for our hearts? The emotional center of our lives. And then the preacher at this point, he inserts his own personal story. He says in verse 12, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that's done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God's laid on mankind. I've seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What's crooked cannot be straightened. What's lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I've increased in wisdom more than anyone has ever ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. That last statement he makes is why we often say today that ignorance is bliss. Because sometimes the more we know about life, the more sorrows we have. And so the preacher describes it as chasing after or striving after the wind. He says that for all of his power, for all of his position, for all of his advantages, he said he's like someone running around trying to get a handful of the wind. Even the very wise cannot fix this broken world. And so back in the 60s, we had Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan wasn't singing to make good music because it wasn't very good. And I'm sorry, if you're a Bob Dylan fan, don't mean to step on your toes. That guy can't sing. And yet he's rated as one of the top singers in history. I don't get it. But what his songs were really more about was philosophy. He was of that generation that thought maybe we can bring some hope back into the world. And yet, the more they sang and the more they did, the hope kind of vanished and everyone was still left just kind of, nobody cares. And so Dylan concludes that the answer's blowing in the wind. It remains mysterious and undiscovered when our view is under the sun. And many intelligent minds have reached the same kinds of conclusions that Bob Dylan did and that the preacher did when we're talking about under the sun. The champion of atheists today, Richard Dawkins, listen to what he said. Human existence is neither good nor evil, neither kind nor cruel, but simply callous, indifferent to all suffering, lacking all purpose. Yeah. That's what life's going to be like under the sun. And so verse 15 says this. What's crooked cannot be straightened, what's lacking cannot be counted. Some things in life are crooked, and the preacher here does not mean in the sense of everything's criminal or immoral. What he means is in the sense of things are bent out of shape. There is so much in this broken world that we wish we could fix, but we just can't. There are some relationships, no matter how hard you try, you're not going to fix them. There are some diseases, no matter how hard you try, they're not going to be healed. There are some moral failings, and I could just go on with a list of things that we can't always fix. There's always something that we wish that we could bend back into shape. But often our efforts only end up making matters worse, don't they? Meaningless. The preacher's going to say that 38 times in this book. And so why bother? Well, that's the question that he's trying to get us to probe into. And as we're going to learn, this view of life that he has that seems so hopeless is because he's looking this way. Ecclesiastes shows us the weariness of our existence so that we will not expect to find meaning and satisfaction and fulfillment in things. Money, sex, power, achievement, none of those things fully satisfy us. There's still an emptiness, there's a void in our lives. And Ecclesiastes shows us our need for an above-the-sun approach. And it's only there that we can find joy and that we can find peace, is when we look above the sun. A life that, as Augustine put it, is no unsubstantial shadow under the sun, but substantial reality under the sun's creator. Well, we've only covered the introduction to this preacher's message. He's dismantled those things that we're prone to clutch in order to try to bring meaning to our lives. Surely it's time for him to talk about God, right? And he's going to, but not in the way that we would expect him to. He wants his words to be honest. He doesn't want any spin to be put on them. And I know that his words leave some of us feeling uncomfortable. Right now, I know that there's some discomfort in this message that I've shared so far. But it's like that discomfort that comes when we're recovering our health. We go through a time of discomfort. And so if you're feeling discomfort right now, can I tell you the preacher would be saying at this point, then I'm achieving my purpose. And so here's what he says about God at this point. Now he's going to say more later on, but at this point, he says, what a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. It's like he takes a picture of the moment in the garden when God put a curse on all that he had created. And yet Adam and Eve, they were allowed to live for a while. He didn't just zap them. But they're going to have to live with thorns and weeds and pain and sweat. And the preacher at this point exalts God as the one who governs it all. And he does not stop the unhappy consequences of us living in this paradise lost. We've got to linger here. But it's here that we learn that salvation does not come by him giving us an escape. Salvation does not come by him by some kind of an immunity from this broken world. And so here's where we have to come to terms with this fact about God. If there is no escape for us under the sun, then rescue is going to have to come from someplace else. And later the preacher's going to explain in one phrase why we will never be satisfied with life under the sun when he says this: God has set eternity in the human heart. Peace and satisfaction cannot and will not ever be found apart from God. To return to Augustine, I love this. He once said, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." You see, that's an above-the-sun approach to life. And so, let me lead by quoting Jesus. In John chapter 16, Jesus once said, "In this world you will have trouble." And in chapter 12 of the Gospel of John, he said, "You will always have the poor among you." Okay, Jesus, you're sounding a lot like the preacher of Ecclesiastes up to this point. But you see, here's the good news. Jesus is going to go farther than the preacher did. Jesus is going to stand under the sun with us. And from there, he's going to look us in the eye, and he's going to take us where the preacher can't take us. Because Jesus then says, "But take heart, I have overcome the world." Lift your eyes up above life under the sun. Because there's a reality there for those who are believers in Jesus Christ. There is fulfillment above the sun. And that's where you and I need to put our trust. So this morning, if you've never put your trust in Jesus Christ, please come and do that today. Turn your life over to Him. It's the only way you're ever going to find fulfillment in your soul. We're here for whatever needs you might have. If it's a prayer request, come and share that. Or if you need to go and share in private with an elder and his wife in room 102, we offer you that opportunity as we stand together and sing.
There's a peace I've come to know, though my heart in flesh may fail. There's an anchor for my soul. I can say it is well. Jesus has overcome, and the grave is overwhelmed. The victory is won, and He is risen from the dead. And I will rise when He calls my name. No more sorrow, no more pain. I will rise on eagle's wings before my God. Fall on my knees and rise.